Rule 3 substitutes. At this point, I want to encourage you to combine Rule 2 players and Rule 3 substitutes together. Okay, so for Rule 3, we're just going to tell you what Rule 3 says, but there are some things in Rule 2 that expand upon Rule 3. Okay? So let's do it. You can substitute players on your team anytime between periods, but during a period only for injury. But between periods, you can do it freely with no reason at all. Your team handicap with the new substitution must not exceed the upper handicap limit of the tournament, obviously. The handicap that you're going to have for your team for that game is the handicap that you had on the field at any one time, and it will never go lower than that for that day, for that game. In between periods, your unlimited substitution is truly unlimited. You can substitute 1 player, 2 players, all 4 players. Just be mindful of that upper handicap limit for the tournament. For an injured player, in other words, substituting during a period, you can only do it when the player is injured. You can do a double substitution if you have to. So, for example, if your 5-goaler gets injured in the middle of a period and can't play, and all you can find is a 4-goaler, you can substitute your 5 for the 4, and then you can substitute your 0 for a 1 if it's available. That generally doesn't happen because players aren't really willing to leave. They want to play. So your 0-goaler is going to want to play. But it can be done. Just know that it's in the rule. Okay, in all cases of substitution, whether they're for injury or just for strategy in between chukkers, or for injury during a chukker, all your substitutes must be eligible qualified substitutes. Okay, USPA members, dues paid, handicap issued. There's a couple special caveats if they're already playing in that tournament. So go to Rule 2 for that. You can use them. You can use players that have played in the tournament under certain circumstances and for certain specific use period of time. So look at Rule 2. It explains it. I explain it pretty well. The rule explains it pretty well, but I just paraphrase it for you. But it's in there. So either listen to it or read it when you're dealing with a situation where you want to use a player that's in a tournament. However, a player that's not playing in a tournament, dues paid, handicap issued, is always a good substitute. Okay, the American rule is discussed in Rule 2 towards the end. So listen to that, and there's a caveat to that we'll go over in a second. The American rule is in Rule 2, players. So listen to that. It's toward the end of the video. It talks about, with the exception of the sponsor of the team, you have to have 1 American player on each team. That means an American citizen, USPA member issued a handicap, or a Canadian USPA member issued a handicap. And then the caveat to the American rule for substitutes is if you're American or the Canadian is considered American for the purpose of that rule, if that player gets injured, with the permission of the host tournament committee, if you can't find another substitute, you can use a non-American for the rest of that game and any other games in the next 7 days, and it won't violate the American rule. The theory is that you had an American and he or she got hurt, so it shouldn't matter who you substitute in because you tried to comply with that rule. That's the theory. It makes sense, so know that. In all cases of substitution, you cannot exceed the maximum handicap limit of the tournament. Okay? Makes sense. You can, however, drop below the lower limit. I didn't know that, but I do now. You can drop below the lower limit, but your team handicap for that game is the highest handicap that you had at any one time on the field. Even if you had it on the field for 5 seconds, you're that handicap for the whole game. If you do a substitution and you drop below that handicap, your team stays at that handicap, okay, for the game. But if you're playing, say, in a 12-goal tournament and you only have a 10-goal team, and you replace your 5-goaler with a 6-goaler, you'll be an 11-goal team. Your handicap will be raised to 11, but you haven't exceeded the upper limit of the tournament, so you're still good. But you will have to play at 11 goals instead of 10, because your team is now an 11-goal team. Even if there's only 30 seconds left and you've played as a 10-goal team the whole time, you'll be raised to an 11-goal team. Okay, that's how it works. If you need to do a substitution because one of your players either got hurt or got thrown off the field or doesn't want to play anymore or got whatever the reason is, okay, let's just say he or she has a business meeting and has to leave, you know, an emergency business meeting or a brain surgery or whatever, okay? And you can't find a substitute for that player. You are allowed to continue the game with 3 players, but you'll have to keep the handicap the same as it was at any one time on the field. So you'll be using your handicaps you had for all 4 players in the field, unfortunately. But that rule has always been the rule, and it makes perfect sense. The highest handicap you have on the field at any one time is your handicap for that game, even if your team drops below that. But if your team rises above that and doesn't exceed the upper limit of the tournament, your team handicap will be raised because at one point on the field you had the higher handicap. Okay, it's always the highest. The rule here goes on to talk about penalty 7. That is covered in specific penalties in another video, but penalty 7 is where if your player gets injured because of a foul from the other team and that player cannot continue, your team has the choice or the option of either substituting that player in accordance with the substitution rules or choosing a player from the team that fouled that is nearest above the handicap of the player that got injured and removing that player. So now you're 3-on-3, and then the teams can do additional substitutions as long as the handicaps stay the same. And of course they cannot exceed the upper limit. So just do this, okay? Let's super simplify it. Add the 3 players on your team together. Okay, so you're playing in a 12-goal, add up the 3 players. And then add the goals you got for handicap. That's got to be equal to or less than the upper limit of the tournament. Make sense? And pull this rule out and this rule book out when you're doing these substitutions just to make sure you do it right, or have your umpire do it. Umpires, when you do a penalty 7, you should run to your rule book or to your third man who has a rule book immediately and go through it line by line. It's only about 5 lines long, but they're a tough 5 lines.